Before 1973, riding in a car without a seatbelt was just normal life in Britain. You could throw your kids in the back seat and they'd be loose there, rolling around on the vinyl whenever you took a corner too fast. No one thought twice about it. In the front, passengers sat without any restraint at all, maybe bracing themselves with a hand on the dashboard if things got hairy. Children often stood between the front seats or sat on a parent's lap while the car was moving. This wasn't neglect or poor parenting, it was simply how everyone travelled. The whole family would pile into a Ford Cortina for a holiday drive to the coast, and the kids in the back were basically projectiles waiting to happen. If you stopped suddenly, they'd slide forward into the front seats or onto the floor. People accepted this as part of motoring. The idea of strapping yourself in seemed unnecessary to most drivers, maybe even a bit paranoid. It took decades of campaigning and some shocking accident statistics before attitudes began to shift. In the 1950s and 60s, you could smoke pretty much anywhere, and no one thought twice about it. Pubs were thick with smoke, so much so that the air itself looked hazy. Restaurants had ashtrays on every table. Office workers lit up at their desks. Train carriages had smoking compartments, and on longer journeys the air would get properly dense. Doctors smoked in their surgeries, teachers in the staff room, parents smoked around their children at home, in the car, everywhere really. The smell clung to everything. Your clothes would reek of stale tobacco after an evening out. Your hair too. Cinemas were foggy. Buses allowed it. Even hospital waiting rooms had ashtrays. If you complained about the smoke, you were seen as a bit awkward, making a fuss over nothing. It was just normal life. Yellow stains built up on ceilings from all that smoke over the years. Carpets got burn marks from dropped cigarettes. People accepted it because everyone did it or knew someone who did. That was just how things were. For most of the 20th century, hitting children was standard practice in British schools. The main tool was a rattan cane, about 3 feet long, imported from tropical colonies. A pupil caught smoking, truanting, or talking back to a teacher would be sent to the headmaster's office or sometimes caned in the classroom in front of everyone. The command was bend over, and the child would lean across a desk or touch their toes while the teacher swung the cane hard across their clothed backside. The traditional punishment was called 6 of the best, meaning 6 strikes. Even through trousers or skirts, this left painful wheals and bruising that lasted days. Less formally, teachers used a gym shoe called a slipper to whack students on the spot for minor offences. Some schools kept detailed punishment books recording every caning. This was legal and considered necessary discipline until it was banned in state schools in 1987 and outlawed completely by 1999. Eventually, people recognised that pain and humiliation weren't effective teaching tools. If you walked onto a playground in the 1950s or 60s, you would have encountered something quite different from what you see today. The standard setup was steel equipment planted directly onto asphalt or packed dirt, sometimes concrete. Slides reached 12 feet high or more, all metal, and they baked under the sun until they could burn exposed skin. Jungle gyms towered overhead with no safety rails, and children would hang upside down by their knees over that hard surface below. Merry-go-rounds spun fast enough to fling kids off if they lost their grip. Seesaws were heavy wood planks that could slam down and catch a child's fingers or teeth if their partner jumped off at the wrong moment. Back then, the attitude was essentially that injuries were part of childhood, something that just happened. A broken arm here, a concussion there, these were seen as unfortunate but not necessarily preventable. Nobody was conducting risk assessments or measuring full heights. Supervision was minimal at best. If a child got hurt, well, that was the price of playing rough. Before 1998, there were no legal requirements for temperature controls on domestic hot water systems. Your bath taps could deliver water at 60 degrees Celsius or hotter. At 60 degrees, it takes 1 second to cause a full thickness scald, while at 50 degrees you've got 5 minutes before severe injury. Most households had their systems set far higher than safe levels. Studies from the 1980s found 80% of homes had bathtub water at 54 degrees or greater. Parents were expected to test bath water themselves before putting children in, and the advice literature warned mothers repeatedly, run cold water first, never leave a child unattended. But accidents happened constantly. A toddler would climb in and turn on the hot tap, or a parent would get distracted filling the tub. In Liverpool during the 1930s, more children died from scalds and burns than from road traffic incidents. Kitchen kettles and buckets of scalding water sat around as everyday features. The risks were simply accepted as normal household hazards that you managed through vigilance, not by making the water itself safer. In the days before easy access to doctors, people treated themselves with whatever they had lying around the house. Kerosene was rubbed directly onto open wounds and mixed with sugar for children to swallow when they had worms. Turpentine got added to lard for chest rubs. If a child had congestion, the mother fried up onions in grease, wrapped them in cloth while still warm, and tied the bundle around his neck where it sat for days until the cough cleared. For weakness or bad blood, folks swallowed large spoonfuls of sulfur mixed with molasses each spring. Possum grease was saved in jars after cooking the animal and then rubbed on chests for lung troubles. Whiskey showed up constantly, mixed with honey for sore throats or taken straight for snake bites. Castor oil was the go-to answer for anything stomach-related. These treatments got passed down through families and applied without measuring or worry. Some probably helped through luck, others did nothing, and quite a few were dangerous by modern standards. If you grew up in the 70s or 80s, you probably rode a bike without a helmet. Not because your parents didn't care, but because bicycle helmets designed for everyday riding didn't really exist until the mid-1970s, and even then almost nobody wore them. Kids rode to school, to friends' houses, across entire neighborhoods, with nothing protecting their heads. No reflective strips, no padding, no adult hovering 20 feet behind. This wasn't considered dangerous, it was completely normal. By the early 90s, that changed quickly. Local governments started introducing helmet laws, motivated by injury statistics and medical studies documenting head trauma. Public safety messaging shifted from teaching children how to navigate traffic to emphasizing protective equipment. The standard became simple. A bare head on a bicycle meant bad parenting. What's interesting is that places like the Netherlands, where helmet use is relatively rare, have significantly lower cycling death rates than America, largely because their streets protect riders instead of expecting equipment to compensate for dangerous infrastructure. The version of safety we adopted was more about easing parental anxiety than actually making children safer. The latchkey kid, named after the house key children wore on a string round their necks, became a common sight in the 70s and 80s. Divorce rates were climbing, more mothers were entering the workforce, and childcare options were limited. By 1982, roughly 3 million children between 6 and 13 years old were letting themselves into empty homes after school and managing their own afternoons. For many kids, this was just normal life. You'd walk home, unlock the door, make yourself a snack, maybe watch some telly or start your homework, then play outside until your parents got back from work. Some children thrived with this independence, learning to cook simple meals and handle problems on their own. Others struggled with loneliness and fear, especially when parents were late coming home. Fast forward to today, and the same behavior that was considered perfectly acceptable can get parents investigated by Child Protective Services. The shift happened gradually as news coverage of child abductions increased and parenting culture moved toward constant supervision. Now, roughly 20% of school-age children still experience unsupervised time, but it's viewed very differently than it was a generation ago. In textile mills, workers cleaned cotton fluff from spinning frames whilst they were still running at full speed, fingers working dangerously close to moving parts. If you worked in a metal pressing shop, the heavy stamp would come down whether your hand was clear or not. There were no guards or emergency stops. Employers argued that fencing machinery was expensive and slowed production, so they simply didn't bother unless forced to. Early factory acts from the 1830s onwards began requiring dangerous parts be securely fenced, but enforcement was weak. Mill owners exploited loopholes and inspectors were too few to catch violations. It took decades of gradually tightening regulations before proper guarding became standard. By the 1960s, legislation spelled out detailed requirements. Every dangerous part had to be fenced unless its position made it equally safe, and safety devices had to automatically prevent contact with moving machinery. This finally eliminated the worst corner cutting. Asbestos was everywhere in British buildings for decades, and nobody thought twice about it. From the 1930s through to the 1990s, The material went into homes, schools, hospitals, offices, and just about every kind of public building you can imagine. It appeared in ceiling tiles, floor tiles, roof sheets, pipe lagging, textured coatings, insulation boards, and even things like toilet cisterns. Builders and manufacturers loved it because it was cheap, strong, fireproof, and easy to work with. If you wanted something that would not burn, would not rot, and would last for years, asbestos ticked every box. The problem was that inhaling the fibers could cause lung cancer, mesothelioma, and a scarring disease called asbestosis. But those illnesses took decades to show up. By the time the connection became clear, millions of tons had already been installed. Blue and brown asbestos were banned in 1995, and all types were banned by 1999. Today, any building put up or refurbished before 2000 is likely to contain some form of asbestos, which is why surveys and careful management are now standard before any work begins. For most of the 20th century, lead was absolutely everywhere in your house and your street. It was in the white paint on your walls because it made the paint tougher and more washable, which seemed brilliant when you wanted to scrub away germs. It was in the pipes bringing water to your tap because lead was soft enough to bend into shape but strong enough to last decades. It was in the petrol your car burned because adding tetraethyl lead stopped engines from knocking and let them run more powerfully. You'd find it in lipstick, in the glaze on your dinner plates, in batteries, in the solder sealing your tin cans. The Romans had loved lead too, using it for everything from plumbing to sweetening wine. But by the 1940s, most people reckoned we'd worked out how to use it safely. The thing is, doctors knew lead-poisoned industrial workers who breathed in massive amounts of dust and fumes. But they assumed normal everyday exposure was harmless. Through the 70s and 80s, researchers slowly proved that even tiny amounts damaged children's developing brains, causing learning difficulties and dropping IQ points. What had seemed like a wonderfully useful metal turned out to be quietly poisoning entire generations. Back in the 60s and 70s, building a bonfire in your back garden was just something you did without much fuss. You'd chuck on whatever needed burning, which often meant old furniture, bits of treated fence panels, worn tires, paint tins, even aerosol cans. Nobody particularly cared that burning plastics and treated wood released toxic fumes or that pressurized containers could explode. If you wanted to get the fire going quickly, you'd splash on some petrol or paraffin and toss a match, consequences be damned. The fire might be 10 feet from your shed or right next to the neighbor's fence, but that was their problem if they complained. Kids would be running about throwing sparklers and bangers with minimal adult supervision, and if the bonfire was for Guy Fawkes night, someone might lob a few fireworks straight into the flames for good measure. These days, burning household waste can land you a fine of up to £20,000, and using accelerants or burning treated materials is outright illegal. What once seemed perfectly normal festive behavior is now recognized as dangerous, polluting, and prosecutable. In post-war Britain, derelict building sites were standard playgrounds for working-class kids, and nobody questioned it. Half-built houses sat abandoned for months, with foundations exposed, scaffolding standing, and loose bricks and timber scattered everywhere. Kids spent entire afternoons navigating between unplanked floor joists, climbing unchecked scaffolding, and using plasterboard sheets as slides down rubble piles. The construction materials themselves became the toys. Timber offcuts turned into bike ramps, cement bags stacked into fort walls, and metal reinforcing rods made swords despite the rusty edges. Parents knew where their children were because every neighborhood had at least one site serving this purpose. The wisdom was straightforward. Kids old enough to walk there were old enough to judge what was dangerous. Broken bones happened regularly, and most families had a story, but that was considered the price of free entertainment. The idea of suing the construction company or that developers had responsibility for securing sites hadn't entered the conversation. You kept away from fresh concrete and didn't climb cranes. That was about the extent of the safety advice. For decades, children riding in the front passenger seat was perfectly normal. Nobody thought much about it. In 1995, before widespread safety campaigns, about 41% of children 12 and younger killed in passenger vehicle crashes were sitting in the front seat. Many of these kids weren't even buckled up. Car manufacturers designed airbags to protect an average-sized adult male, not a small child, which turned out to be a lethal mistake. When passenger side airbags became common in the mid-90s, they started killing children in crashes that would have been survivable otherwise. The airbag would deploy and strike the child's head and neck instead of the chest, causing fatal injuries even in low-speed collisions. Between 1993 and 1997, dozens of children died this way. In 1996, a massive public information campaign began urging parents to move children to the back seat. By 2006, only 21% of children in fatal crashes were in the front. The change happened relatively quickly once the danger became clear, but it took a lot of dead kids to get there. Walk into most homes today and you'll find harsh cleaning chemicals locked in high cabinets with bright warning labels and childproof caps. This wasn't always standard. For decades, people kept bleach, ammonia, drain cleaners, and pesticides in cupboards below the kitchen sink with minimal labeling. Sometimes these chemicals were transferred to old drink bottles, which meant a child could mistake clear liquid for something safe to drink. Products like furniture polish, toilet bowl cleaner, and rat poison sat alongside everyday items without distinction. The chemicals themselves were harsh, containing sodium hypochlorite in bleach, lye in oven cleaners, and petroleum solvents, all capable of causing severe burns or poisoning if swallowed. Even small amounts could be fatal for children. The shift came as poison control centers started tracking thousands of calls annually about household chemical accidents involving children. Manufacturers introduced warning labels ranked by danger level, child-resistant caps, and tamper-proof packaging. Storage recommendations now emphasize keeping everything locked away high up and never transferring products to food containers. This reflects understanding that prevention beats dealing with chemical burns or emergency room visits. For a long time, getting a job at 14 was normal and even encouraged. You'd see kids that age doing paper rounds at 6 in the morning, stocking shelves after school, or working weekend market stalls. Some took on heavier work like washing cars or helping in warehouses. Parents encouraged it as a way to learn responsibility and earn pocket money. Society viewed teenage work as character building rather than exploitation, but this attitude shifted over the 20th century as child labor laws grew stricter. Britain followed similar paths, with rules restricting 14-year-olds to just 2 hours on school days and banning them from hazardous jobs. The shift happened gradually but completely. What was once normal teenage independence became heavily regulated to protect education and safety.